Weirdness. When we refer to something as weird, do we mean it as something as an outlier, as in weirdly good, or simply odd? Or does it lean into the supernatural? Weirdness. Is it a spectrum of things, thoughts, or people that run from the mere offbeat to the outright bizarre? Weirdness. Many times weirdness is thought of in the negative or as surprise, like when people may say, "I just got entirely weirded out." Weirdness. Is it in the clothes we wear or how we present ourselves? Today I'm wearing purple like two of my greatest heroes. So what really constitutes weird? Especially as this is a booktube channel, what makes a book weird? We may never know the answers to these questions. But wait, oddly enough, I have some suggestions for those who like a little strangeness in their reading. See what I did there? So today we're talking about books that lean into the weird a little bit. And while I've discussed all of these books in prior videos, I thought this might be a great compilation of a bunch of books that really fall in different weirdness areas. And I think you'll see what I mean here in a moment. Because what makes a book weird, right? Is it the structure? Is it the plot? Is it the characters? Is it the overall atmosphere of the book that makes it weird? Today, what I'm going to do is share with you a couple of examples in each of those categories. So if there's a particular sense of weirdness that you're maybe magnetically drawn to, maybe you'll find something to love here. Let's not wait around anymore and let's get into it. So let's start off today's conversation with a couple of books that are structurally weird. And what do I mean by that? I guess books that really fall outside the boundaries of the normal fantastical that us as fantasy and sci-fi readers are very accustomed to. These break the boundaries even of those kinds of books. The first one I want to talk to you about today is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Structurally, this is one of the strangest books I've ever read. It's got 5 stories within it, but they are all sectioned off. Basically, the first half of the book tells 5 stories. The second half of the book continues those stories, but it does so with a mechanism in time where we get time breaks between each one of the segments. And in the first half of the book, the time is moving forward. And in the second half of the book, the time is moving backwards and we're going back to the original stories. And we're seeing how what kind of ended up as books 5 or segments 5 rather and 6 in this book, how all of that was initially impacted as we go back in reverse all the way to the back one. Now, I've made this a 5-star book, and if you know me at all, I notoriously am stingy about 5 stars. I didn't give this 5 stars because I just love the book so much. I gave it 5 stars because this has such a structurally weird way of going about things that when I put the book down, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not necessarily about the events or the characters at all. Mostly about the author, thinking, this guy is so brave to come up with, this type of a structure. I doubt he's the first to ever have done it, but certainly it's the first of its kind that I've read. So I really wanted to make Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell the first book we talk about here today when it comes to weirdness, particularly structural weirdness. I've got another one. Let's discuss it. And that other one I have on ebook, so I will throw it right here. This is Simon Jimenez's The Vanished Birds. It is structurally weird. It's not quite as structurally weird as Cloud Atlas, but if you get into this book, you'll see by about chapter 2, and if not then, for sure by chapter 3, what I'm talking about when it comes to multi-POVs and a structure that is in and out of different areas of time, and yet they all kind of blend together later on. This book didn't make a whole lot of sense to me until about halfway through, and that's okay. When it comes to my reading, I don't always prefer the mundane. I like getting thrown for a loop, and I think if you've read enough books, you may find yourself in a similar situation. You like those books that kind of throw you going, what? I don't understand what's going on. Tell me where we are here. That's very much The Vanished Birds. I don't want to get too much into it without spoiling it, but again, The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez falls within this kind of structurally weird, strange, different type of story. Check it out. Let's move on to the next category. And real quick, before we move on, if you've not yet liked this video, it really does help the channel a ton. Even better if you think about subscribing if you like this type of content. If you don't worry about it. I also want to say a quick thank you and a shout out to the patrons of this channel. We have both a Patreon and we now have channel memberships within YouTube. It gives you all kinds of cool emojis and custom stuff that we do in the live streams that we do very, very regularly here. So Patreon's available, channel memberships are available. All right, enough of that. Let's get back to the topic at hand. Now, the next category is going to be about strange plots or strange characters. Now, these all have to be kind of really out there, right? Because we're in speculative fiction. We are in fantasy and sci-fi, and in my case, lit RPG a lot of the times. So these plots and these characters have to really stretch the imagination if we're going to call them weird, because a lot of the fantasy books, a lot of sci-fi books we already read, they've got plenty of weird characters. So where should we start? I'm going to start with a book. I don't have it on physical. I'll show you right here. This is called The Library at Mount Char. This is by Scott Hawkins. This has some extraordinarily weird characters. It has an extraordinarily weird plot. We think there's this mystical library. Well, we know there's a mystical library that is supposedly run by a guy named Father, but we find out literally on page 1 that Father, God or whoever, has gone missing, and it's up to one of his librarians, Caroline, to figure out what happened to Father, to basically round up her brothers and sisters, each who manage a different section of this mystical library, and try to get to the bottom of this mystery, which is very fantastical, very supernatural, very horrific. So I would throw this into a horror category as well. The book is just very strange plot-wise. We're not exactly sure what's going on. And as we meet these individual librarians that are basically, you know, the quote-unquote brother and sister of Carolyn, they're very strange too. So much so that this was really the first book that I thought of when it came to making this video about, you know, strange books. I thought, you know, The Library at Mount Char is absolutely one of the strangest books I've ever read. I got to share it with the community. That's the first one in this category. Let's move to the next one. So regarding plot and character weirdness, you'd be pretty hard pressed to find something that's got a weirder plot and weirder characters than Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I love this book a ton. Now, it's funny because you'll see on BookTube, there's a lot of people say, oh, it's like a retelling of the Canterbury Tales. Okay, find me anybody on BookTube, at least in this corner of BookTube, that is not named Philip Chase or A.P. Canavan or Janny Wirtz that has actually read the Canterbury Tales. Maybe Laura from Fantasy Awash, maybe Alan from Library of Alexandria, but that's it, okay? None of us have read the Canterbury Tales. We don't know what it's about. But we know it's about a bunch of different people on travels explaining to each other what brings them to the journey that they're on. So you've probably heard there is a big bad in this book called the Shrike. He's exceptionally weird. Maybe it's a she. We're not exactly sure. We don't know what his powers are. We know it kills a lot of people. We know it manipulates time. We know that what has happened to the characters in this book plot-wise is extraordinarily weird. There is an element called the time tombs. That is extraordinarily weird to me. And the fact that each of these characters come from something so far different in life than any of the other characters, to me, that's basically like putting, I don't remember how many stories there are. I think I want to say 7. I could be wrong. Correct me in the comments. But I think there's 7 people on this trek, and they all have such vastly different backgrounds. It's almost like this motley crew, weird gathering of people. But unlike a motley crew, they're not really, you know, teaming up out of necessity. They're telling stories out of necessity because they're stuck on this journey for a long time together. Hyperion, Dan Simmons. Is it a weird book? Absolutely. And I find it to be weird because of the plot and the characters. Let's move on to the next one in this category. All right, we've got one that's got a very weird plot. We are going to some classic sci-fi by Arthur C. Clarke. This is a standalone book called Childhood's End. This is a first contact story. If you're unfamiliar with first contact is, that's just when mankind meets aliens for the first time. Now, this is a very short book, but my gosh, does this pack a punch. You know what? I even matched Childhood's End today. Cool. All right. Unexpected bonus here on BellTube. All right. So what's this book about? Like I said, it's the first time aliens are making contact with humanity, and they do it in a really weird way. And the plot device at the beginning is very strange. I'm not giving anything away by saying that these spaceships are hanging above the major cities on Earth just long enough, talking about decades here, for people to just get used to it, right? They're not even really talking to them much. They're not doing a whole lot, but they're just there for people to look at them as kind of a commonplace thing before subsequent generations really find out what those aliens are doing and why they're there. Now, the second half of this book really takes a plot twist. It gets into the bizarre. It gets into the very, very strange and weird. And again, when I was trying to curate this list of weird books for you guys, Childhood's End, I'm going to say about the last third of it is some of the strangest stuff I've ever read, but it's very compelling and it is very memorable. I've had only a few books in my life that I've thought of like in my dreams at night afterwards for several days later. One of them we're going to talk about here in a minute, but Childhood's End is also one of them because I did not see it coming. And it's not like a quote unquote twist in the story, right? It's the natural progression of the story if you really start to understand where he's going with the book. I think it probably becomes very clear on reread what he's doing, but the first time you read this book, I promise you the last, like I said, 25-30% of this is gonna stretch your imagination in the category of weirdness. I love this so much. This is a 5-star standalone read for me. Let's move on to the next category. So the next category of weirdness I am calling atmospheric weirdness. The first one, by far, you've heard me talk about this book a lot on this channel. This is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I am telling you nothing about this book other than to read it. It's a 5-star standalone. It has one of the weirdest atmospheres I've ever read in my life. Like I'd mentioned earlier in the video, I had dreams about this book for about 3 nights thereafter. This is incredible. I absolutely recommend Piranesi to anybody who just wants a little bit something different, but do yourself a favor. I tell this to people every time they contemplate this book. Don't find out anything about it prior to reading it. Don't read the back. Don't read a review. Don't watch a review. Do nothing. You will get 100 times more out of this book, and it's not very long. You can read this in a day for sure, but you'll get way, way more out of it the less you know about the book. You don't need to know about the characters, the premise, nothing. All I've told you here is the atmosphere is very weird, and that is by no means a spoiler. That's just kind of prepping the table for you to sit down at and enjoy. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. One of the weirdest atmospheres I've ever read. Let's talk about another one. Now, you might have thought this would show up here somewhere. Of course, I'm a big advocate for it. When it comes to weirdness, it is very difficult to outdo the weirdness that is Severian. Of course, I'm talking about The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. All right, so I'm combining all 4 books together as one Book of the New Sun, as Gene Wolfe, the author, intended. I'll flip a graphic right here. You'll see the book cover. All right, so what makes this book weird? Tons. Okay, this kind of encompasses almost all of the categories that we've talked about, but for these purposes today, I'm going to talk about atmosphere. This is a dying Earth. This is a far distant future, but the atmospheres themselves change as we follow Severian along his path throughout these 4 books. Nothing is really the same from books 1, 2, 3, or 4, and they get weirder and weirder and weirder as the book goes on. And in fact, it's interesting because, you've heard this already. I'm sure I'm not, telling you anything you don't already know, but there's a lot of people that will say this book is really intended for rereads more than, the initial read. And while I kind of concur on that, I think you'd pick up a lot of stuff in books 1 and books 2, especially having read all of Book of the New Sun. I still think the exploratory nature of this story as we follow Severi and the Torture gives us some weird environments like I've never seen before in a book. Definitely weird atmospheres. Now, are there weird characters? For sure, 100%. Is the plot weird? Definitely the plot is weird. But the overlying thing for me is the atmosphere. The atmosphere of Book of the New Sun, it kind of makes you wonder, where am I? And there's people that have speculated this is far distant Earth, but it's set somewhere, in South America, maybe, because the more south they go, the colder it gets, and the more north they go, the warmer it gets. So that maybe makes sense. But knowing Gene Wolfe, none of it really has to make sense. Read it and find out. The Book of the New Sun, atmospherically as weird as they get, but I love it a ton. Okay, so when we're talking about all the categories today, we're talking about atmosphere. We're talking about plot. We're talking about structure. We are talking about the characters. When I think of a series that has got weirdness in all of those aspects, the number one series that comes to mind, and it is a top 5 all-time series for me, and that is Stephen King's The Dark Tower. This thing is so weird. Structurally, it's fantasy. It's sci-fi. It is, a genre-bending Western. There's some romance in it. It's got really a multi-genre feel to the structure. We also have world hopping. Again, that's kind of in the sci-fi area, but the way that it's done, it's a little bit strange. Character-wise, you'd be hard-pressed to find some stranger characters, particularly as we get to about, I'm going to say book 3, but really book 6 and book 7. We run into some characters that are just flat out as weird as they go. I don't think it's any great surprise for any of you to hear that Stephen King has written his magnum opus, and it is completely weird as hell. Now, I love it, right? The Dark Tower, for me, gave me a hangover. I do not get book hangovers very much, but at the end of book 7, I am one of the people, and maybe you've heard that it's got a controversial ending. Not for me. I loved it. It couldn't have been done more perfect for me than any book I've ever read. So, yeah, The Dark Tower. It's got the atmosphere. It's got the weird characters. The plot is so bizarre. We're on this trek to find the Dark Tower, but it meanders a lot. And so, yeah, we do have this overarching plot of following the beam to the Dark Tower and meeting up with these characters who become our quartet, our group, our found family. But it does it in some of the weirdest ways I have ever seen in my life. And I think if you've not read The Dark Tower, this should climb up your list. I'll tell you right off the bat that The Gunslinger, which is book 1, for most people, including myself, is a bit of the driest of the 7 books. But it is necessary reading. If you just skip right to the Drawing of the Three, which is book 2, you're going to miss out on some very important backstory, which matters later in the series. Just read The Gunslinger. I know a lot of you guys actually love The Gunslinger, so that's cool too. But The Dark Tower, the structure, the plot, the characters, the atmosphere. It's got them all checked off when it comes to weirdness, and I think you're going to love it, and that's going to get me to the one for the road today. So today's one for the road is all about quote-unquote normal versus weird. Now, where do we want to be, right? I mean, do we really want to be considered totally normal? For me, I don't, right? I like kind of being a little bit out there. If you've watched BellTube at all, you know this channel is totally out there half the time. But I do suspect that a lot of people kind of want to conform to more of a normal sense of what they think is average or is normal and don't want to be considered weird. By the way, the more money you make, apparently you become less weird and more eccentric. Go figure. Anyway, wanted to just share a quick thought with you about it's okay to be weird. You've heard that saying, let your freak flag fly. I do believe in that. Unless you're just so weird that you're off-putting to other people and you make people uncomfortable with just general out of bounds type of behavior, then yeah, you probably want to take a look at that. But when it comes to just having certain, predilections for doing certain things in a certain way, and maybe it's different than other people, then I say go for it, because all the greats in history, they weren't mundane. They weren't the average. They were considered probably a lot weird, if not just a little bit. Most of them were probably considered a lot weird. And I'm going to end today by basically sharing with you something that I learned when I was a kid, and so did you. If you ever watched the Mr. Rogers show, okay, or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, when you're growing up, you'll recall that Mr. Rogers told all of us at the end of each episode, he likes us just the way we are. And I think that is so powerful. And I believe that's a message that gets lost as we turn into adolescents and then into adults, that we're cool just the way that we are. And if you're a little bit different, or if you're a little bit weird, don't be afraid to share it with the rest of the world, because I think what's going to happen is they're going to appreciate you for being you, and they're going to find things in your personality and in your skill sets and in your talents that maybe they otherwise would not have, and I think they will benefit from you just being yourself. I like you just the way you are, same as Mr. Rogers. I love having this channel, you guys. It's just a complete blast to me. I hope you like this selection of weird books. We've got more weird things coming up on the channel as well. Stay positive, and of course, until then, here's your fortune.